This is Marcus Allen, who knows a lot about a lot. We're talking today about moon landings. And before we get into this, it's important to give it a little bit of context, I think. The Apollo program in America ran from 1969 to 1975, which seems an awful long time ago. It was more than 50 years ago. And it's important, particularly because there's a whole generation now who can't really remember in person those times when there was no internet, there were no mobile phones, and there was no digital camera. And that is something that I know Marcus is going to come back to. And the Vietnam War was getting quite heated, and the Cold War was going on between America and Russia. And there was apparently a space race. And it was a very different world to the one we have now in many, many ways. So Marcus has been talking about this for 20 and more years, and he's told me about all the TV programs he's been on, the radio programs he's been on. I've seen some of the articles he's written, and I've been to some of the talks he's given. But Marcus, why is there so much interest now, 50 years on? What is it that sparked this renewal of interest?
Basically, it was sparked by the rapid expansion of the internet and the World Wide Web.
Okay.
Because suddenly people had access to information that in the past they would have had to go and buy books or magazines. Now, in our present day, we can literally switch on our computer, put in a search subject, moon hoax, and you'll get millions of responses. And you could spend the next 3 months reading them all, which most people won't do. So there are people who have, shall we say, condensed down the most important aspects of the alleged moon landings. I say alleged because there is no evidence it actually happened the way we've been told. NASA, God bless them, National Aeronautical and Space Administration, or as the New York Times dubbed them, never a straight answer, because they tended not to answer correctly. The Apollo program was created as a response to the Soviet Union launching Yuri Gagarin. Remember, he was the first man in space?
Yeah.
Well, we now know that he wasn't the first man, he wasn't the second, he wasn't even the third. But he was the first one to return alive. That's the difference. Okay. Because that caused considerable reaction in America, their new president, John Kennedy, had only been inaugurated 4 months earlier, in January 1961. That's when he was inaugurated. In May 1961, he made a very famous speech in the joint houses of Congress. It's on May the 26th that it happened, when he said, "We will send a man to the moon and return him safely to the Earth." Wow, that got everybody very excited and very, that's what we're going to do. We're going to beat the Russians. The Russians have been up in orbit already. No American had been into orbit at that point. So they were a bit behind. So they had to get themselves organized. They had to find out what to do in space, because no American had been into space, let alone into orbit. The first American into orbit was John Glenn, about 9 months later. So they started this. And so they started off 1961. Well, how do we get to the moon? We need a big rocket. So we'll build a big rocket. But they got all these German scientists, these Nazi scientists that had been brought over by America after the Second War under Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip, was it not? Yeah.
Operation Paperclip. They brought them over because they were the people who knew about rockets, because they'd been firing them at London for a few months. 2,500 V2 rockets had been launched at London.
Yeah. And
1 or 2 of them had landed and caused all manner of problems. They weren't publicized very much because it was considered to be bad for morale. Probably fairly bad for some of the houses they landed on. But anyway, they brought these Nazi scientists over, Werner von Braun being the most famous. There were several others who worked very extensively. If they had remained in Germany, they'd probably been prosecuted at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal.
Indeed.
Because they had basically committed war crimes,
Indeed.
Crimes against humanity. But that was overlooked because America needed good rocket scientists. Yep. So they were brought over. So you say the Apollo program started, in fact, it started earlier than 1969. That's the first time they landed on the moon, but they'd been practicing before that with the Mercury program, that was the one man in space, followed by the Gemini program. This is 2 men in space. This is all in Earth orbit. We're not talking very far away, about 200 miles up. That's where Earth orbit is. Going to the moon is a completely different ballgame. That's 240,000 miles away. So they had to work out how to get there, because you have to achieve what's called escape velocity.
Okay.
You have to be going fast enough away from Earth to overcome the gravitational attraction of Earth, which is pulling you back.
Yeah.
Which is why when you throw something up in the air, it always comes back down again. That's gravity. That's what Isaac Newton observed when the apple fell on his head. Oh, how did that happen? Well, that was a few hundred years ago. So you have to get a rocket powerful enough to overcome Earth's gravity.
Yeah.
To achieve escape velocity. It's 25,000 miles an hour in round numbers. Quite fast.
Yeah.
Earth orbit, to get into Earth orbit, you only have to be doing 17,500 miles an hour.
Okay.
So anybody who can appreciate the inverse square law, in order to increase your speed by 50%, you have to use twice the energy.
Right.
That's why the rocket was so big. So we had this huge, great rocket, 360 foot high, height of St. Paul's Cathedral. Most of it was fuel. It's only the top little bit, which was the command module, the capsule that the astronauts were in. So all this was going on over the 10 years prior to, well, 7 years prior to the Apollo 11 launch. That's the one most people remember, Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. Do you know why it's called Buzz Aldrin?
Tell me.
The only other person I know who's called Buzz is Buzz Lightyear, who was named after him. No, Buzz, he was called Buzz because his sister, Edwin Aldrin's sister, is his official name, couldn't pronounce the word brother. She called him Buzzer.
Oh, there you go.
He was called Buzz. He's always known as Buzz Aldrin. He's still alive now. Neil Armstrong died 2012. One of the most famous Americans in American history. Where is he buried? He's buried at sea off the coast of Florida. He was a naval pilot, so he could legitimately request a naval burial, which he received. That was 2012. He's been dead a few years. Buzz Aldrin's still alive. Michael Collins is still alive. He was the 3rd man on Apollo 11, the forgotten astronaut. So anyway, all this is going on. They're desperately trying to work out how to get to the moon.
Yeah.
And there were various accidents along the way, the most famous being Apollo 1, where 3 astronauts were literally incinerated in their craft. It was a test because they had pressurized the spacecraft with pure oxygen at 22 pounds per square inch.
Gosh.
Well, anybody who's done any physics will tell you, if you pressurize oxygen and introduce a spark, the thing will go whoop, bang. It's called a calorific bomb. That's how you measure calories. But that's another story. They were incinerated because they couldn't get the door open. So that was a bit of a tragedy. So they had to redesign the whole craft. This is January 1967 that happened.
Okay.
They only had 2.5 years to land on the moon.
Yep.
And they just blown up their spacecraft. Oh dear. Now, this is the point at which I think things start to get interesting. Was there enough time to redesign the spacecraft and to work out what to do to get them to the moon? And most important, get them back again. Plenty of spacecraft have gone to the moon, but how many have ever come back from the moon to Earth? 1 Soviet craft, and we're told 9 Apollo craft. Apollo 8 was launched in December 1968. It orbited the moon. Apollo 10 orbited the moon. Apollo 13, which maybe we can come to later to explain what happened there. These are our heroes from Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin. Now this is how I started all this research. I literally had to go out and buy a set of postcards like this. I had to buy a set of postcards because other than pictures in books, this is all I could find. Postcards. Astronomy show in London, it was. This is before the internet. So having looked at these, because I'd heard a talk down in Glastonbury as it happened, early 1990s, where somebody said, he was talking about something quite different. He wasn't talking about Apollo, he was talking about megaliths. And he just made an offhand remark, because we were showing a lot of photographs of the megaliths, which are equally interesting. He said, of course, you've probably seen those photographs of the Apollo craft taking off. And taking off is fine. Landing on the moon, he said it's all fake. And you can tell it's fake. You look at the photographs, and you know what you're looking for. You'll see they're faked. So that's why I went out and bought the photographs, so I could see, because I've been trained as a photographer in London in the early 1960s. That's how old I am. Oh dear. And I'd used the cameras that I subsequently discovered were used on Apollo, or a similar one, the Hasselblad single lens reflex, probably the best camera you can buy then, the best camera you can buy now. I'd used those cameras. I knew what they could do. I also knew what the film that was used could do, because I was trained technically as a photographer to be able to develop and enlarge photographs, which is as skilled a job as taking them in the first place. Absolutely. So I knew what to look out for. And as soon as I started looking at the pictures, I thought, hang on, I could see what he means. There's something odd about it. There's all this light that appears to illuminate them. And I know that you can put light into a photograph. That's why cameras have flash guns on, because it adds light into the shadow areas where there may not be light. This is probably the most famous one, which shows it. This is Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11, walking down the ladder. There's the hatch through which he's just come, and he's lit up like a Christmas tree. I looked at this photograph and I thought, hang on a minute, where did that light come from? And I thought, it could be the reflection off the lunar surface, because we know that light is reflected off the lunar surface. It could be earthshine. I soon found out it wasn't earthshine. Like you get moonshine, the sun hits the earth, it will reflect light, because the earth is directly overhead at Apollo 11's landing, or ledge landing. So was it reflection off the lunar surface? And I thought, not enough, because the reflectivity of the lunar surface is 8%. 8% of the light hitting it is reflected. Same as a road surface. And a road surface isn't blinding. You can see it, and you can see what it is, but it doesn't blind you as if you were looking into a mirror. So 8% of the light is reflected, and that is not enough to be recorded on the film that was being used to take this photograph, Kodak Ektachrome film. This is not a digital image. This is a photographic image, photographic film image. The photographic film is very different from digital. It has limits. It's a very good means of recording information, but it was not a digital camera that was used. It was not a point-and-shoot camera. These are cameras that had to be operated by hand, manually. The only automatic feature was the film being wound forward in the key. You press the button, or you press it on the front of the camera. You press the button, the film automatically winds forward. If it winds forward, ready for the next shot. It takes about 1.5 seconds to do that whole procedure. You have to focus it yourself. You have to set the aperture yourself. You have to set the shutter speed yourself. And there's no viewfinder, because on a Hasselblad camera, the viewfinder is normally on top of the camera. So you look down into the camera. But there's no viewfinder on the cameras on the lunar surface. So how did they get such well-exposed, well-composed, accurately focused photographs with a camera that was mounted on their chest? So they had to move their body to point it. And of the 121 photographs taken on Apollo 11 on the lunar surface, there are thousands more taken on other missions. All the same camera, or the same type of camera. It was one for each astronaut. No viewfinder. And they all come, virtually all of them are okay. They're accurately focused, well composed, etc., etc. I've forgotten the gloves. Armored gauntlets, because they're wearing their spacesuit. You can't wear half a spacesuit. You've got to wear the hat, or the helmet, the gloves, the boots, the whole thing. And it's pressurized at 5 pounds per square inch, the internal pressure, because of another very important aspect of the whole moon landing story. You have to take humans, we're very delicate little creatures. We can't survive without pressure. We're designed to be pressurized. Where we are now, say at sea level or close to sea level, we are experiencing 14.7 pound per square inch all around us. 14 points, that's quite a lot. That's 700 pounds per square foot. That's a couple of tons per square yard, a square meter. That's the weight of a car, a square meter. So there's a lot of pressure, but we don't feel it because inside us is just as much pressure pushing out, which is why when you climb Mount Everest, 30,000 feet high, unless you have your own oxygen, you probably will die. Not from lack of oxygen. There's enough oxygen in the air around you, but there is not enough pressure forcing it into your lungs against the back pressure holding it back. The pressure, the atmospheric pressure on the top of Mount Everest is 5 pounds per square inch.
What is the atmospheric pressure on the moon?
Good question. 0. You've heard that space is a vacuum. Basically, there's nothing there. There's no atmosphere on the moon at all.
So they had to have pressure in the suits. What would that have done then to the camera?
Well, it would be okay if the camera is inside the capsule if it was pressurized. But now we have another problem because photographic film cannot survive in a vacuum. About 3 years ago, I attended a lecture in London where the designer of the camera system of the Hexagon spy satellite, technically KH-9, very proud of what he'd done, quite rightly too, described the camera system because this was photographing Russian rocket sites, Russian bombers. This was late 1960s. This is the Cold War bit. So America is sending up spy satellites into low Earth orbit, but 200 miles up, so in space. And he said, almost as a matter of, as if everybody knew, well, of course, we had to pressurize the film because it wouldn't work in a vacuum. So we had, and he showed where the little gas bottle was that kept the pressure inside, because the whole camera setup and the film was all encased in a pressurized environment. I thought, hang on a minute, I've never heard this. And the reason I hadn't heard it up till then is because that information had only recently been declassified. It's a spy satellite. Obviously, America isn't going to tell people what it does. So they keep it secret. What they kept secret was the working of it. Photographic film doesn't work in a vacuum for this very simple reason that there are two aspects of a vacuum which we don't experience very much here on Earth because we're not in a vacuum. We have to create our own vacuum. We all know that, in space nobody can hear you scream because sound will not travel through a vacuum. What also happens is that if you put any form of liquid-based material and photographic film, the emulsion on photographic film is liquid-based, it will what's called outgas. The light elements are literally ripped out by the vacuum because there's no pressure. They're ripped out.
Would that apply even if the film stayed within the camera?
Yes, it would say, because the cameras were not pressurized.
Oh, okay.
There are plenty of photographs of cameras, of the Hasselblad cameras used on Apollo. Plenty of those around. You can see them in many photographs on all Apollo missions. If they were pressurized, they would be surrounded by a case. Probably wouldn't be a very big case, but these cameras are not surrounded by a case because there are also film of astronauts changing the magazine. On the Hasselblad, the magazine can be detached from the camera. So say you're shooting a black and white film, you can put a color film on in the middle of doing. So these cameras were not pressurized, nor were the film cameras. The film cameras are mounted inside the lunar module, filming what was going on outside. They were not pressurized either. And we've done experiments. I have colleagues in Canada who have done these experiments. They've literally bought a commercial vacuum chamber, something about the size of a wheelie bin. The vacuum is measured in a unit called torr, named after Evangelisco Torricelli, who was an Italian scientist who developed the barometer. It's named after him, torr, T-O-R-R. Atmospheric pressure is equivalent to 760 torr. That's similar to the barometer, which has 760 millimeters of mercury. So when you get to space, it's not only 0 torr, it's 10 to the minus 3. That's 1,000th of what it would be on Earth. 1,000th. And that's in low Earth orbit. When you get to the moon, it's 10 to the minus 12. It's such a minute fraction of any form of pressure that it's basically a perfect vacuum. It's not a perfect vacuum because you can't have a perfect vacuum in science, but you get very close to it at the moon. So if you got the vacuum on the moon, how did they get all these photographs? If photographic film cannot work in a vacuum, they were taken here on Earth under controlled studio conditions. They weren't taken on the moon. They couldn't have been taken on the moon. And if anybody can prove me wrong on that, I want to hear about it. I've asked that question for 25 years, and I'm waiting to be corrected. I said it on television, I've said it on radio, I've said it on the internet. Prove me wrong. And nobody has proved me wrong. In fact, more people have come forward to say, you're right. You're quite right.
Fabulous. Okay. So that's the photographs and the vacuum. I mean, that in itself would be sufficient for an awful lot of people, wouldn't it? Is there not another area that I'd just like to go into a little bit here, and that is the radiation? Because recently I've been reading in the press that there's now talk about maybe sending more people up to the moon, and NASA themselves are saying that one of the challenges is actually the radiation belt around the Earth. And whilst I'm no scientist, it did occur to me that if they managed to do that 50 years ago, how come they can't do it now?
Good question. Good point. A lot of people have asked that, actually. Let's go back very slightly. December 2014, NASA launched Apollo 2.0. It's called Orion. So they decided to test it. It's called EM1, Exploration Mission 1. Sent out 3,500 miles, which goes through what's called the Van Allen radiation belts, and it was brought back again, primarily to test the heat shield, because you have to have a heat shield. I can get onto the heat shield if you like. And they also carry radiation meters on board, and it was measuring levels of radiation that were considerably higher than humans can legitimately withstand. So, the point you make, how did they do it 9 times with Apollo? Because 24 astronauts launched on Apollo, 3 of them didn't land, 6 of them landed, and 3 of those astronauts flew twice. John Young, Gene Cernan, and Alan Shepard flew twice to orbit the moon. Gene Cernan on Apollo 10 and Apollo 17. Yeah. They weren't damaged by the radiation, because what radiation does is it affects your DNA. You get mutations. One of the results of radiation damage, you get mutations in the genes, and if you have a child, you may have a mutation, or you may not look good. No astronaut has had a child after going into space. No Apollo astronaut has had a child after he went into space. So why is radiation so damaging, which most people agree it is? I mentioned the Van Allen radiation belts. They're the belts of radiation around Earth, and they're created by the Earth's magnetic field, which is, we know, goes from north to south. At the poles, the north and south pole, there's less radiation, so there's less protection. I say there are 2 belts. One is the inner radiation belt that goes from about 500, 600 miles up to about 3,000 miles up. And there's a gap. Some people will say there is a belt there, which is created by the what's called Operation Starfish Prime, which was both the Americans and the Russians in the 1960s, would you believe, set off nuclear explosions in space. See what would happen. Oh my God. I mean, how mad can you get? Dr. Strangelove was a documentary, it wasn't a film. These are mad idiots who are exploding nuclear bombs in space to see what would happen. Well, they found out what would happen. They created another radiation belt. And you go a bit further out, you get the outer radiation belt, which goes out to about 20,000 miles. Now, all these is an accumulation of the radiation that's already in space. Because when you get past the Van Allen belts, you're in space, which is full of radiation. It comes from the sun, it comes from galactic cosmic rays. You know, we've heard of solar flares. They're so powerful, some of them, they can knock out electric grids on Earth. First one was the Carrington event in 1859. It didn't do very much damage, couldn't have much electricity at the time, but it caused terrible problems. People who were actually using Morse code on the telegraph were getting electric shocks.
So the radiation, I mean, there's an awful lot of it up there, obviously. It goes out an awful long way. And it's clear that the guys couldn't get through that. They would not have been able to get through that and back again.
They could get through it because it's not a physical barrier.
Right.
Radiation is rather like light. You get through, you shine a bright light, you can go through it. Radiation is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, of which visible light is a part. Mm-hmm. But it's not a physical barrier, but it is a biological barrier.
So how would it have got inside the spacecraft?
In the same way that light gets into a spacecraft, through windows. It could also quite easily get through the aluminium shell of the spacecraft.
Okay.
When you go to have your tooth x-rayed, that's using x-rays. And the operator of the equipment will be probably wearing a lead apron, or will leave the room. And the room is lead lined to protect other people nearby. Because radiation goes everywhere. It goes through everything except lead, uranium, and water. They will protect you against radiation. But the problem with lead, uranium, and water is they're heavy. So basically you can't have a spacecraft surrounded by lead. There isn't a rocket that'll get it up into space.
So the aluminium shield would not have protected the spacemen from the radiation?
Certain frequencies. Gamma rays, most certainly not.
Right.
X-rays, possibly. If you remember a few years ago when you went through airport security, if you were carrying a film camera, you was advised to have it hand searched and not to put it through the X-ray machine because it would fog the film. Fogging means it would reduce the contrast, that's all. And professional photographers would have lead-lined pouches. They would carry it so there was no background radiation damaging the film. And all photographic film, and this may all sound very 20th century and historic, and why do I need to know this? Because Apollo was using photographic film. It wasn't using digital. That is a key point.
The radiation would have affected the film, even going out. So we've got the rocket going up. It's going through the radiation belt, which is affecting not only the occupants, the human occupants, but everything on board, including the film in its little plastic cases and so on. Then apparently the spaceship lands on the moon where there is a vacuum. And so the light is all wrong on the moon. You've explained that beautifully. The film wouldn't work, not only because it's already been radiated, but because it can't work in a vacuum. So they could not have taken film, and they've got the big gloves and there's no viewfinder and so on. The shadows are all wrong, the lighting's all wrong. And it must be quite hot up there, or going up or coming back. Is there not also a heat element to all of that?
It's very, very hot indeed. Okay. When you're in a hot room here on Earth, there are various ways to cool it down so that you feel comfortable, because humans are quite comfortable at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees centigrade. That's a comfortable working temperature. If you go out in the sun, direct sunlight, it could be as high as 100 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 80, 85 degrees centigrade, and you feel uncomfortable. So what you do is you either, if you're in a room, you open the windows or the doors, or you turn the air conditioning on, or a fan, which moves the air. Now in space, because it's a vacuum, you can't air condition the spacecraft because there's nowhere to dump the heat. You take the heat out of the room. It's like a reverse refrigerator. You take the heat out of the room and dump it outside. And that's all they're doing. They're dumping the heat outside. In space, you can't do that. There's nowhere to dump the heat. You can't dump it into a vacuum because it's an insulator. Like a thermos flask has a vacuum, a very thin vacuum surrounding the liquid, and it'll keep liquid at the temperature which you put it in at for quite a considerable time. So you can't air condition the spacecraft. So how do you keep it cool? Because you can work out the internal temperature of the spacecraft. It's called the black body radiation temperature. calculation, it uses the Stefan-Boltzmann constant. I'm not going to get into the detail, it's a bit technical, but using the figures, like Earth, you can calculate the temperature of Earth and the moon and a spacecraft.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science.